So the 2024 general election is 13 months away, just about. And while that seems like a lot of time, in politics, time tends to fly pretty quickly, especially with the ongoing news cycle. Some things that happened months ago feel like they happened just the other day. So 2024 will be here before you know it. So I figured I'd make one of these videos and maybe a couple videos like this over the next week or so, sort of analyzing hypothetical matchups between the various Republican candidates and Joe Biden, since I haven't done one of these types of videos in a while. And, we're getting at that point in the primary where things are getting really close to actual voting. So, the first votes in the Republican primary will be cast in about 3 or 4 months. So we're really getting to that point where the Republican primary is really, really heating up. And I figured I'd take that time to take a quick reprieve from the Republican primary and focus more on the general election side of things. As with all my presidential predictions, we'll start off from the West and work our way east. If you want to see the rankings for how I rank the various states, it's in the description box below. We're going to get to that in just a second, but first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So we'll start off with the state of Nevada. Now, Nevada, as I've talked about in a lot of these videos, is one of those states that Republicans seem to inch closer and closer to actually winning, but always usually falls short. Of course, we go back to the 2020 election. Donald Trump made some extremely marginal progress in the state. He lost it by 2.4%. He got 47.7% of the raw vote. In 2016, he got 45.5% of the vote and lost by about the same margin. So you did see some shifts towards the Republicans in Clark County. That's the main population center in Nevada. It's about 2/3 of the state's population. You also saw a shift in Washoe County as well, home to Reno. So the two largest population centers in Nevada saw a shift to the right. In 2020, you saw Washoe County shift to the left, and you saw Clark County shift very slightly to the right, which basically got us the result that we had back in 2016. Just obviously the raw percentages were different since you had less of a third-party factor. So going ahead to 2022, of course, we had that Senate race in Nevada. I thought was going to go Republican. Many analysts thought it was going to go Republican. That ended up not being the case. Catherine Cortez Masto won extremely narrowly. She won by 0.8%. Adam Laxalt did better in Clark County than Trump did both in 2016 and 2020, but it wasn't enough. He got 45% of the vote. Catherine Cortez Masto got 52%, so he lost the county by 7 points. And of course, in Washoe County, he actually did worse than Donald Trump. So Washoe County seems to be trending a bit left, while Clark County seems to be inching more and more to the right. Again, Donald Trump lost Clark County by 9 points in 2020. The Republicans only lost it by about 7 in 2022. So somebody like Nikki Haley, again, I think her biggest strength and the area where I think she's going to improve the most on Donald Trump is white college-educated voters. And you do have a contingent of those in Nevada, but you also have a fair amount of Latinos as well. But given how unpopular Joe Biden is in the state of Nevada, and again, if we pull up the civics numbers, and civics is a little bit harsh on Biden, I think, than some of the other aggregates, but when you really average them all together, the results are pretty similar. If we go down to the state of Nevada, Joe Biden is at a 55% disapproval rating to just a 38% approval rating, again, against somebody like Nikki Haley, who is only unfavorable by about 5 percentage points. So Nikki Haley's favorability is very low. It's only 30%, but her unfavorability is also very low. So I think in this hypothetical situation where Nikki Haley is actually the nominee, you're going to see more attention drawn towards her. And something I found interesting about Haley is that I think even some like soft liberals have a favorable view of Nikki Haley because she seems like she comes across as a more moderate type of Republican compared to the Donald Trumps or even the Ron DeSantis's in the eyes of some liberals. So I think in this matchup, given Joe Biden's unfavorables, I think Nikki Haley would be able to win the state of Nevada fairly narrowly. I think she'd probably win it by about a point and a half. Again, Nevada's been slowly drifting into the Republicans' column. All she really needs to do is get Clark County within about 5 percentage points, which is really just doing slightly better than Laxalt, and she probably would be able to win Washoe County. Down ballot Republicans can win Washoe County typically in these sorts of things. I mean, if you take a look at 2022, Joe Lombardo, who ended up becoming the governor of Nevada, didn't even need to win Washoe County in order to actually win the state as a whole. He lost Washoe County very narrowly by about a 1.5 points, and he still was able to beat Steve Sisolak because he did better in Clark County, or really because Steve Sisolak did worse in Clark County, only getting about 51% of the vote, doing a bit worse in Washoe. So again, Joe Lombardo wins overall by about 1.5 points. Adam Laxalt loses by about 0.8. So I think this is a state that Republicans can win with Nikki Haley on the ballot against Joe Biden. Now again, some of the more MAGA conservatives in the audience might disagree with that because they think Nikki Haley is somebody that can't attract the sort of Trump base. That's sort of a myth that's been going around for a while. And while it's true you do need a Republican that can energize the base, you also have to factor in that Nikki Haley is going to draw white college-educated voters and overall do better with college-educated voters than somebody like Donald Trump or even Ron DeSantis would do. And I think that would put her over the top in the state of Nevada. Moving on down to Arizona. Arizona, of course, has historically been a Republican state. It's only gone blue twice since 1964. Once, of course, in 1996 with Bill Clinton, mostly due to the vote split with Ross Perot. And then, of course, it went blue again in 2020 with Donald Trump. Now, it did go blue very narrowly. And the reason he lost is because he lost Maricopa County, which, like Nevada, takes up about 2/3 of the state population. A lot of these southwestern states have most of their populations controlled really in one or two metro areas. And in Arizona's case, it's really Phoenix and the Tucson area. Now, we take a look at the shift from 2016 to 2020. Maricopa County shifted about 5 points to the left. Arizona as a whole shifted about 3.5, 4 points to the left. So, the state really only votes to the right of Maricopa County by about a point or so. And that's really what put Joe Biden over the top in this state. I think somebody like Nikki Haley would do fairly well in the Maricopa County suburbs. Again, she's a candidate that's viewed much more favorably by educated voters, and the suburbs have been getting more educated, more racially diverse. And Nikki Haley is somebody who, while she might be perceived as a candidate to many of those that are sort of online, who would turn off segments of the Trump Republican base, I think she would gain immensely among college-educated voters. I mean, Nikki Haley is viewed favorably by Republicans by a considerable amount. There's only really a 20-25% segment that don't like her, and that's really the hardcore Trump base. But again, Nikki Haley's somebody who I think can bridge the gap, who I think would be probably one of the stronger nominees to go up against Joe Biden. And RCP backs that up. If we take a look at the early polling, and again, I'm somebody who doesn't really like to take early polling very seriously because a lot of things do change. But if we're going to factor in early polls, and some of the people supporting DeSantis and Trump have done that, Nikki Haley beats Joe Biden by 4.5 points in the RCP average. So a lot of Joe Biden's support in 2020 obviously came from Democrats, but a lot of the people in the middle, that support came from people that didn't like Donald Trump, didn't really like Joe Biden either, but just disliked Donald Trump more. But when they see somebody like Nikki Haley, who's a good talker, who's a perceived more moderate politician, has very good optics for the suburbs, that's somebody that they're going to vote for. So ultimately, somebody like Nikki Haley, I think could win Maricopa County by a few points, and I think she'd win Arizona by a few points. So I'd put Arizona in the lean Republican column. Colorado was a swing state, going back to 2008, 2012, even 2016, arguably. It actually voted to the right of Virginia when you actually look at the margin. Hillary Clinton won Colorado by just 4.9%. In Virginia, she won by about 5.4%. So Colorado actually voted to the right of Virginia. That's probably the last time we're going to see that for a long time. But, even with Nikki Haley's strengths, even with somebody who could do better in these suburban counties, can do better with educated voters, Colorado is just one of those states I think demographically is just really gone for the GOP. I think 2022 really proved that. In the Senate race, we saw, Joe O'Dea, who was put forth as a more moderate candidate, was pro-gay marriage, pro-abortion. And, some could argue he really turned off segments of the GOP base. But when you look at the actual margins in some of these rural counties, he only does slightly worse than Heidi Ganahl, who was the more conservative Republican candidate on the ballot. He did do better in the suburbs. He outran Heidi Ganahl by a couple of points, but it really doesn't matter at the end of the day. Colorado is just a really blue state. So I think even somebody like Nikki Haley would probably lose Colorado by a considerable margin. This is a state that keeps trending more and more to the left. Back in 2020, I believe Joe Biden won the state of Colorado by 13 points. So this is a state that really isn't in contention for the GOP anymore. And I think even somebody like Nikki Haley would probably lose Colorado by 10 or 11 points. Moving on down to the state of New Mexico. Similar thing, New Mexico is a state that people talk about sometimes in terms of Republicans being able to flip the state because they're doing better with Hispanic voters. But you have to understand, in the state of New Mexico, and the exit polls back this up, you have white voters voting for the Democrats by a couple of points. So if Democrats are winning the white vote, they're certainly going to win the state, especially a state that's plurality Hispanic. So I think in New Mexico's case, really not going to be that competitive. Again, Joe Biden is pretty unpopular here. If we take a look at his favorabilities in New Mexico, he's underwater by 9 points, but that's still a lot better than Nevada, where he's underwater 55-38. So again, he's underwater by 9 points. That's not really going to jeopardize him losing the state just because of its partisan lean. So I think Joe Biden would still win New Mexico by a likely margin. Going on down to the state of Texas, this, of course, is one of the most important states for a Republican to win. It's still a state that leans in the Republican category. In 2020, Donald Trump won Texas by over 5 percentage points. Now, that's a pretty small margin, historically speaking. You go back to 2016, he won Texas by 9 points. Romney won it by 15. McCain won it by 13. So it's a state that's been overall trending to the left. But there is something that could stall that a bit, and that is, of course, more electable Republican candidates that don't alienate moderate independent voters the way that sort of the MAGA type candidates tend to do, especially in the suburbs. You know, we go to 2020, look at some of these suburban margins, you know, Houston, for instance, 56-42, Dallas, 65-33, Fort Worth going blue. That's one of the biggest cities that Republicans up until recently were winning, and one of the biggest conservative metros. That narrowly went blue in the 2020 election. San Antonio 58-40, and of course Austin 71-26. Austin's one of the fastest growing parts of Texas. It's also one of the areas that's fastest going Democratic. Now, if we take a look at the 2022 midterms, and we take a look at the race for governor with Greg Abbott, who really carried the whole ticket across pretty comfortably. Greg Abbott won the governorship of Texas by almost 11 points. And if we take a look at those suburban and urban margins we looked at earlier in Travis County, he's only losing that by around 10 points. Trump lost that 56-42. If we look at Dallas, 63-36, so he's improving there. Fort Worth, he's winning 51-47. San Antonio, he lost by about the same margin that Donald Trump did. You know, that's another area that's been trending more left due to tech jobs and increasing diversification. And then we look at Austin. That's one of the only areas where Greg Abbott actually did worse than Donald Trump, which just goes to show you how quickly the Austin area has been trending more and more left. I mean, Williamson County narrowly went to Joe Biden. That's a county that Greg Abbott was able to win very narrowly. But Hayes County going to Beto O'Rourke by 11 points. So the Austin area has really, no matter what Republicans running, has continued to trend left. I think the state of Texas as a whole, however, going up against somebody like Joe Biden would go to any Republican pretty comfortably besides Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump would still win Texas, but I think it would certainly be a lot closer than it needs to be. But when we take a look at the unfavorable ratings and the approval rating in Texas for Joe Biden, the disapproval rating's 58-33. And there's really no way you're going to be a presidential candidate and win the state of Texas with those numbers. So I think Nikki Haley would probably win Texas by probably the strongest margin of any of these candidates. Again, Nikki Haley's also from the South, so I think she'd perform a bit better in some of these southern, more educated suburbs. I think she'd probably win the state of Texas by about 10 points or so. Moving up to Nebraska's 2nd Congressional District. This is an urban suburban district. It's Don Bacon's district. It actually went to Joe Biden in 2020 by about 7 percentage points, 52-45. And Don Bacon, of course, won this district, I think, very narrowly in 2022. If we pull up the House results, I think he won by about just 2 points. This is a district that keeps getting closer and closer every election cycle, and it keeps getting bluer and bluer. So yeah, I was right, about 2 points. So, you know, going into 2024, I guess the real question is whether or not Nikki Haley can actually keep Nebraska's 2nd Congressional District red as it was in 2022. Again, it seems to be a bit more versatile. Again, the boundaries for this district are a bit different than they were in 2020. I think Nikki Haley, based on her suburban strength, could win very narrowly. But again, that really doesn't change the fact that suburbs as a whole are still a problem for the GOP, even if somebody like Haley is doing better in them. Over the past couple of decades, Republicans have lost a lot of ground in them, and that's probably only going to continue unless Republicans sort of change the way they're campaigning, change their messaging, and really change how they're appealing to these types of voters. Moving on up to Minnesota. Minnesota hasn't voted for a Republican presidential candidate since 1972. I don't think 2024 is going to be the year that changes. If we go back to 2020, Joe Biden won Minnesota pretty comfortably, 7.1%. That's a very similar margin to Barack Obama in 2012. In 2016, Donald Trump lost Minnesota by 1.5. So Hillary Clinton had a pretty awful performance in Minnesota. Now, what's interesting about this is that Donald Trump's percentage of the vote was about the same as Mitt Romney's. I believe Mitt Romney got about 45, so he got 44.9. If we go to 2020, Donald Trump only increases his vote share by 0.4%. Obviously, Joe Biden's increasing it pretty substantially by about 7 or 8 points. So Minnesota is a state that's not really going in the Republican direction. Again, Republicans couldn't even flip the attorney general's seat, and that was against a candidate who was soft on crime in an election cycle where crime was a pretty big issue. You know, Keith Ellison is a very, very progressive left-wing prosecutor, and Minnesota kept him in office by about a point. So, you know, this isn't a state that's really going to be that competitive. You know, I think Joe Biden's still going to do fairly well here. I think he'll probably end up winning Minnesota by about 5. So I think Nikki Haley will slightly improve in the Minneapolis suburbs, but it's just a region that's been trending further and further to the left, and I really don't think Nikki Haley or any other Republican this cycle is going to break that anytime soon. Moving on down to Iowa, I think Iowa would probably, and this might be a bit of a bold take, but I think in this matchup, I think Iowa would be safe Republican. Now, if we take a look at Joe Biden's approval rating in the state of Iowa, it's absolutely abysmal. It's almost as bad as what it is in Texas, which is interesting because Iowa actually voted to the right of Texas in the 2020 election. But Joe Biden's at a 57% disapproval rating, just a 34% approval rating. And I think Republicans have room to grow in some of the rural areas in Iowa. Again, they still haven't maxed out some of these rural counties. Again, Donald Trump is winning some of these rural counties by only about 20 points. I think Republicans can easily improve on that, and I think somebody like Nikki Haley might even improve in places like Polk County, Lynn County, Scott County. These more urban counties where you do have those educated suburbs sort of surrounding these cities. I think she can win the state of Iowa by about 12 points. You know, maybe that's a bit of a bold prediction, but again, I think she would improve not just in the urban areas, but also the suburban areas. We take a look at how well Governor Reynolds did there back in 2022. Again, in 2020, she won the governorship by, I think, about 4 percentage points. This time around, she actually overperformed Chuck Grassley, who's really an institution in Iowa, fairly comfortably, 58-39. So she's winning this by nearly 20 percentage points. I think somebody like Nikki Haley could easily bring the state of Iowa to about a 12-point margin of victory for Republicans. Moving up to the state of Wisconsin. Now, this is probably one of the most important states for a Republican candidate to win. You know, we go back to 2022. Wisconsin gave us a split verdict. Ron Johnson won re-election here by just a point, while you had Tony Evers beating Tim Michaels 51-47. So you had about a 3.5-point margin for Tony Evers, and then the opposite, you've had about a point margin for Ron Johnson. So this state really is the toss-up of toss-ups. Nikki Haley's performance would really depend on how well she does in the WOW counties. Again, some people argue, I think falsely, that Donald Trump's really the only Republican that can win a lot of these rural Wisconsin counties. And again, we're talking presidential turnout here. And there are some voters who only vote for Donald Trump. That is true, but it really depends on what percentage of the electorate you're actually working with. And I think in terms of the actual electorate, that percentage is going to be very small. Now, Nikki Haley, I think, would be the type of candidate to make up whatever ground she loses in the rural areas, in the WOW counties, and in Milwaukee. But I don't even see her doing that much worse in the rural areas than Donald Trump. I think it is a bit of a myth that Donald Trump is the only Republican that could win these areas. You know, rural Wisconsin has been trending right since 2008. 2010, you saw Scott Walker do very well there. Ron Johnson, obviously. 2012, during the recall election that failed, Scott Walker again did well in rural Wisconsin. And even Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan did better in the rural areas than McCain did in 2008. And then fast forward to 2016, Trump did probably the best out of any of those candidates and flipped Wisconsin for the first time since 1984. And then going ahead to 2020, Donald Trump very narrowly loses Wisconsin. So I think the attention being put into this state, the fact that I think Nikki Haley would do significantly better in these suburbs, I think she'd be able to win the state of Wisconsin very narrowly. I think out of the Republicans running, she would be the strongest candidate to go up against Joe Biden. Now, again, that doesn't mean she's the most conservative candidate, and from a Republican perspective, that doesn't necessarily mean she's going to be the best on policy if you're sort of in that Trumpian wing, but I think looking at how she would do in these battleground states, I think overall she'd probably do the best. out of any of the candidates currently running. Hopping over to Michigan, this state is a bit difficult because Michigan in 2016 voted Republican for the first time since 1988. Donald Trump won by just a very narrow margin here, but he was able to keep the liberal suburbs around Detroit somewhat manageable for a Republican victory. He only lost Oakland County by 8 points. The Ann Arbor area, he's only losing by about 40 points. And again, 40 points is a massive margin, but when you take a look at 2020, the fact that this area trended about 6 points to the left, it does show you that in 2016, Donald Trump had better performances here. Oakland County, 56-42 for Joe Biden. That's really what did it. Grand Rapids, same thing. These types of metro areas that were more Republican friendly, getting bluer and bluer. Of course, Muskegon County flipped from red to blue in 2020, and ultimately the state of Michigan voted for Joe Biden by 2.8%. So going forward, Michigan is certainly a state that I think is within reach for some Republicans, but you know, taking a look at the 2022 midterms, when you had abortion as a top issue, when you had social issues at the top of the ballot, Michigan is a pretty socially liberal state. And overall, somebody like Tudor Dixon, who was pretty right-wing, very pro-life, did very poorly here. She lost by over 10 points. So this state is very tough territory for any Republican. I think as of right now, I think Joe Biden would narrowly win Michigan against Nikki Haley, although I do think she probably would get the state very close. I think the suburbs just continue to trend more to the left, even if Nikki Haley does improve in some of them and does slightly better in the rural areas. You know, coupled with Joe Biden's popularity, I think the state narrows up, but I still don't think it actually flips. Because again, Joe Biden is still an incumbent. Even if he is unpopular right now, things could change in the next 13 months. But as of right now, I think it very narrowly goes to Joe Biden. Moving on down to Ohio, this is a state like Iowa that I think is pretty comfortably going to go to Republican. I think Ohio would probably vote for Nikki Haley by about 10 points. So I think it'd be closer than Iowa. I think Iowa would vote to the right of Ohio. I think somebody like Nikki Haley would improve in places like Dayton County. She'd win Dayton County back. Probably do better in the Cincinnati area. Unclear how she would do in northeastern Ohio, but again, given how red the Ohio rurals have become, I don't think there's any realistic way she can come close to losing the state. It's really just a question of what the margin would actually be. Ohio is now pretty much almost solidly in the Republican category, so she'd probably win the state of Ohio by about 10. Really up in the air what areas she's doing better in. Probably the more educated suburbs. She'd probably do better in the Columbus area. Obviously, Cincinnati, as I mentioned. Maybe some of the working class areas she slips a bit, but ultimately it's quite negligible. And places like Delaware County, I think she'd win by much more comfortable margins than Donald Trump did back in 2020. Starting up, I guess we'll go from Maine and work our way down the eastern seaboard. Maine at large, I think, would still go to Joe Biden. Comfortable enough. I think Nikki Haley would win the 2nd district by about 10 points. So, you know, really not much different than what we saw in 2020. Maine isn't really an area where Republicans are increasing their vote share anymore. You know, the 2022 midterms, Republicans did pretty terribly here. You know, Susan Collins is really the only type of Republican that can win here, but I think even somebody like Nikki Haley is just way too conservative to make the state that competitive. Moving on down to the state of New Hampshire. Now, New Hampshire is a purple state when it comes to the statewide level, but of course, nationally, it's a pretty blue state. It's also a state that tends to vote against the incumbent. Back in 2020, we saw New Hampshire go for Joe Biden by about 7 points. Back in 2016, Donald Trump very narrowly lost the state by 0.3. I think Nikki Haley would improve in New Hampshire. I think she could potentially be the type of candidate to make it close. As of right now, I still think the state leans in Joe Biden's direction just because there's so many different variables and factors you'd have to look at to see whether or not if Nikki Haley would be the type of candidate to win here. But again, she's not really that sort of libertarian Republican, the type like the Chris Sununu type to really win here. I still think the state would go blue. Moving on down to Pennsylvania. Now, this is another interesting one because Pennsylvania, like Wisconsin, like Michigan, is a more socially liberal state. Nikki Haley is a bit more of a 2004 type Republican who does have pretty good appeal in the suburbs. But again, you have to look at the overall general election environment. You have somebody like Joe Biden who's in his 80s, and you have somebody like Nikki Haley who's probably in her early 50s. So there's a big age contrast there. Nikki Haley certainly has more energy than Joe Biden. And she has a certain appeal among women voters and just the college-educated voter base at large. So this would be a situation where I think somebody like Nikki Haley would improve in the collar counties. Again, that was kind of my theory with Oz. Oz was just a very flawed candidate in general. Nikki Haley does not have the baggage that Dr. Oz has. Obviously, Dr. Oz's biggest flaw was that he wasn't actually from Pennsylvania, or he just moved there very recently. So, also, his campaign made a number of mishaps very early on that really made it nearly impossible to recover in time. Again, had the general election been held in December, or maybe even January, maybe Dr. Oz would have won if you didn't have all the early voting. But again, sharing the ballot with somebody like Mastriano is really just a death sentence for any Republican in Pennsylvania. Regardless, in the northeastern part of Pennsylvania, I think Nikki Haley would still do about where Dr. Oz did, probably slightly better, but she's not really that much of a working class Republican. I think her strength would really be in the Philadelphia collar county. These suburbs are definitely more left-leaning than, you know, say the Atlanta suburbs or the Maricopa County suburbs. So I think she can make inroads here. Again, she's not Donald Trump. Donald Trump was very toxic in these suburbs. She's not Ron DeSantis either. Ron DeSantis is much more of a culture warrior than she is. So I think she would do slightly better in the suburbs here. Again, if we pull up the 2020 results, Bucks County, I think that's an area where she could win, especially given the fact that Joe Biden is, I think, more underwater in Pennsylvania than he is in Michigan and Wisconsin, but we can take a look at those numbers now. Joe Biden's at 57% disapproval, 36% approval. So again, if he's going up against somebody like Nikki Haley, I think he has no shot. I think she would do better in Lancaster, these more historically Republican areas. And again, even if she does slightly worse in some of the rural counties, which I'd find hard to believe given how unpopular Joe Biden is, but let's say that does happen, I think she would do better in Bucks County, Lehigh County, probably Northampton, do better in Chester, and I think that'd be enough to win the state very narrowly. Again, I don't think any Republican is really going to beat Joe Biden by a very large margin, but I think Nikki Haley probably has the best chance out of any of the candidates so far. Moving on down to Virginia, I think many people have a very false impression of Virginia after the 2021 governor's race. The fact that Glenn Youngkin was able to win was very impressive for the Republican Party, but you have to keep in mind that that happened under a very specific set of circumstances, and we're also talking about a national election where turnout is going to be different. You're going to have a different electorate than what we had in 2021, and the issues are different than in 2021. So while I think Nikki Haley would certainly do better in Virginia, I think she could win places like Chesterfield County back on the presidential level, James City County, Virginia Beach potentially, maybe Chesapeake, Stafford County. It still wouldn't be enough. That puts you at about Romney 2012 margins, which would mean she'd lose the state by about 4 to 5 points, which is probably what I think would happen if she goes up against Joe Biden. Again, things could change. I think it's really heavily going to depend on where the economy is by then and where the issues are in 2024, what issues are at the forefront. If we take a look at Joe Biden's approval and disapproval in Virginia, he's only underwater by 10 points. Virginia is still a blue state. Even though it is sort of a likely blue state, it's not a solid blue state. I still think Joe Biden would probably win the state of Virginia at this rate, even with somebody like Nikki Haley. Moving on down to North Carolina. North Carolina has been slowly trending to the left on the presidential level since 2016 and 2020. Donald Trump only won the state by 1.3. If you go to 2022, Ted Budd won the state by about 3, so he did better than Romney. About the same as Trump 2016 in terms of his actual margin. But this is a state that does lean in the Republican direction, but it has overall been trending more leftward because of the shifts we've been seeing in Mecklenburg County, the Wake County area, these just suburban, urban, highly educated counties. And these are counties where I think Nikki Haley would do exceptionally well in North Carolina. So I actually think Nikki Haley would win North Carolina fairly comfortably. I think she could win the state by about 5 points against somebody like Joe Biden. Again, if we take a look at Joe Biden's approval rating in the state of North Carolina, it is very, very low, 54 to 39. So it's not Iowa low, it's not Pennsylvania low, but it's still low nonetheless. And I think somebody like Nikki Haley wouldn't really have a problem winning here against Joe Biden. Moving on down to Georgia. Now, this is a state that has been trending leftward, just like all the states we've really talked about. You know, you could argue the Rust Belt is sort of stagnant, but it's still a lean blue area. So out of all the toss-up states that we're really looking at, Now that Iowa and Ohio are basically off the table, the only real toss-up state that sort of leans in the Republican direction is North Carolina. Again, maybe Arizona, potentially Georgia, with the right candidate. But, you know, the map becomes a bit more difficult when you look at how the suburbs have been trending. And, you know, part of that is Donald Trump, but also part of that is just down to demographics. Georgia is one of those states where it's really demographical. Donald Trump lost Georgia by the narrowest margin of any state that he lost back in 2020. He only lost by 0.2. Georgia went pretty red in the 2022 midterms in all races but the Senate race. And, you know, Herschel Walker was the candidate. He was a very bad candidate, and he also was the Trump-aligned candidate. Brian Kemp had publicly sparred with Trump, but he hadn't compromised his conservative principles. Brian Kemp is still a very conservative Republican, and when you go issue by issue, he's more conservative than Donald Trump, especially socially. And he was able to win the state of Georgia by over 7 points. So you have Brian Kemp winning by 7, the rest of the statewide Republicans winning by, 5, 6 points, and yet you have Herschel Walker losing. That really goes to show you that it was a Herschel Walker issue and a Trump issue more so than just a Republican issue in this midterm. Now, Republicans did have higher turnout in Georgia than they did in other states, but again, Nikki Haley has that suburban appeal. She has that white-collar appeal, and I think that's something that would bail her out in the Atlanta suburbs. She wouldn't win the Atlanta suburbs. She would still lose them. Brian Kemp lost the Atlanta suburbs. But I think given the fact that Joe Biden is so unpopular in Georgia, and the numbers in Georgia are much higher than some of the other states we actually talked about. In Georgia, Joe Biden's underwater by 20 points. So with somebody like Nikki Haley versus somebody like Joe Biden, it's really, really difficult to make the argument that Joe Biden would be able to win the state of Georgia with approvals that poor. So I think Nikki Haley would win Georgia. And obviously we saved Florida for last. Nikki Haley would have no problem winning Florida. Joe Biden is incredibly unpopular in the state of Florida. And really, it's just a state where Democrats have been just dropping the ball every chance they've gotten. 57 to 36 are the disapproval numbers in Florida. I think Nikki Haley easily wins the state by 6 or 7. Again, could be even more than that. It really just depends. I think obviously Ron DeSantis would probably do the best out of any Republican in Georgia. But this would still be an excellent showing for a Republican candidate against Joe Biden. 298 to 240 obviously is good. Republicans win the presidency. They win the Senate. In this scenario, they probably win the House as well. So you'd be looking at a Republican trifecta. So it really all depends on the candidate quality, who the nominee is, and of course what the circumstances are. But as of right now, I think Nikki Haley would beat Joe Biden 298 to 240. I'd like to hear your guys' thoughts below. Leave them in the comments section. As always, again, thank you all for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next one.